and that is Ingo Dachwitz. He is a media and publication scientist and member of the association called Digitale Gesellschaft, Digital Society. After last evening in France, for example, you can imagine that in Brussels there were a lot of celebration. But today, surely there's going to be a lot of tough work because it's all about the e-privacy regulation of the European Union. That's where most incredible interest groups are clashing. Some want certain freedoms, others have certain economic interests, and how to handle all that. And what we can do, that is what Herr Dachwitz is going to talk to us about. Thank you. Yes, hello and welcome from me as well to the talk Lobbying Battle in Brussels. Is it endless tracking or not? It's a crash course about the e-privacy reform. Who of you came here because of the German pun in the title and is expecting a funny talk, and who wants to learn something about data protection? Well, that is a fairly good sign, because even in a year where the Chancellor and Interior Minister will not tire of saying how our data protection is, there are people that take an interest in the topic. But I think it's probably good that I didn't name the talk after the piece in netzpolitik.org or the actual name of the law, which is suggestion or a draft for a regulation about respecting private lives and protecting personal data in the electronic communication, and to repeal the Directive 2002/58/EC. Well, it is about the regulation that the Commission has drafted earlier this year, and those that came here because of the German pun in the title, which I didn't translate, by the way, a short crash course about the topic. Why is this actually a relevant topic? Respecting private lives and data protection in electronic communication. So a short crash course on tracking. This certain uneasiness that one or other person feels when you think about what happens to our data and the fact that we keep producing data, I think that is a feeling that many of us know. But normally in everyday life, it's easy to ignore that. But then there are some scandals such as the naked in the network scandal that happened earlier. These scandals bring it into the forefront and into people's minds again. So just to refresh, last November, I think it was, that a certain reporter team from the North German public broadcaster, NDR, with very little effort and very little money, was able to buy browser histories also from members of parliament and a judge, including interesting details about sexual preferences. So an uneasy feeling is what most people in Germany have, according to surveys. It's easy to say that there is a problem there, but most people really do feel that way. An EU survey in 2015 revealed that in that year, only 32% of Germans trusted internet and telephone providers, and only 19% trusted the internet business economy as a whole. 70% of Germans said they were worried about how data is used and whether it's used for other purposes than it was originally acquired for. And according to an EU survey in 2016, as many as 42% of German internet users sometimes refrain from visiting certain websites because they are worried about their internet activities being monitored, observed. Time is not long enough for us to give a very comprehensive talk about tracking, but just to bring this back into the forefront. An American researcher ran an automated analysis of the 1 million most visited websites in 2015, and he found that 9 out of 10 of these websites sold or shared user data with third parties. That doesn't say what is actually being done with those data, but 9 out of 10 would share usage data with 30 third parties. And The web tracking field is a large one, of course, but you can observe a certain monopolization or concentration of web tracking capacities at certain large providers. According to this study from 2015, 78% of those 1 million website visits were handed over to Google. And in second place, there was Facebook with 32%, but there is a strong concentration in the market there. And a special study within that study found that these 9 out of 10 websites, the same happens about the 80,000 websites that deal with health communication of some form or other. So 91% of 80,000 investigated websites in the health sector shared user data with third parties. Very particularly active industry when it comes to analyzing user behavior is news websites. The Tactical Tech Collective has their trachography tool, which you can find under trachography.org and still use. I can only recommend it. In 2015, they found that most German news websites, besides netzpolitik.org, of course, shared usage data with third parties. And if you take all this together, Spiegel Online, Heute, Zeit, so the major news magazines and broadcasters with their websites, it's more than 100 unintended connections with other servers that receive data, not just in Europe, but also in the US. And if we talk about web tracking, so following and recording user behavior, then for a long time it has gone beyond cookies. With increased awareness of the cookie issue with users, the fact that cookies are used to follow us through the internet, and more people have started protecting themselves against cookies, for example, deleting them after each session automatically. Tracking companies have found ever new methods of following us in the web. For example, the so-called browser or device fingerprinting, where users of websites are identified via the settings that they have made in the browsers that they use or with the device that they use, without cookies being required for that. The settings are so granular, so manifold, that most users have an individual set of settings, so they can be recognized that way using the settings, just via the settings that they have made or have not made, that have been made automatically. Other forms exist too, more invasive forms of cookies. There are flash cookies that are harder to delete, or cookies that have already been deleted, so-called zombie cookies. They can resurrect. In the meantime, tracking methods even exist that follow users across several devices, the same people on their various devices. So, of course, tracking that with third-party companies that are specialized, that is not all. If you look at the first-party data, the data that the providers themselves received, for example, about apps that we use, if you consider the data that's exchanged between WhatsApp and Facebook, but also the information that is recorded with at our internet or telecom providers. So even that is not enough. Companies are working on recording our carbon-based life forms as well, what we do in the real world, and linking that to what we do in the digital world. For example, the Oracle company is one of the largest players in that business, and they advertise that they can find information about individuals from various contexts, their shopping behavior, for example, and can merge that into one single profile and link the information. And that information then is bought from companies such as Snapchat or by those companies so that they can enrich the knowledge they have about their users. And then there is a further form, so it's still not enough, the real offline tracking, so to say, the possibilities of following our actual movements in the supermarket or in a shopping mall. And that is based on the fact that our devices, whenever they are looking for a Wi-Fi network or a Bluetooth device that they can connect to, they send certain identifying numbers. The MAC address, for example, or the IMEI or the other numbers. So that is used, for example, to track movements in the store. How are the people walking through my store? Where do they stop? Where do they not stop? What's the flow of traffic? But you can also follow movements through various stores if there is a unique identifying number, and that does exist. And another thing, even though it's in its early days, the Internet of Things, we're in the age of smart machines, and we have all kinds of smart sensors that make our lives easier, right? There are network toothbrushes, coffee machines, refrigerators, toilets even these days. There are toys such as the doll that was outlawed in Germany recently, and even our sex toys can connect to the Internet. Well, yeah, soon there will be a smart condom as well. Finally. And last but not least, smart assistant systems that make our lives at home so much easier. And I'm not about to say that every network device in the household will always record things that is not allowed to record, but in some cases that is a fact. For example, that smart vibrator that I showed, or the doll, my friend Kyla, that was outlawed. We shouldn't forget that the Internet of Things, of course, is an Internet of Things that is connected to people. The Internet of Things is not just machines communicating, but data and information about people is transmitted. And that's why it's important and good that the EU is working on the rules for that kind of thing. E-privacy is the word for that. Since January, the draft by the Commission for the e-privacy regulation has been published, and the e-privacy regulation is a so-called sector-specific supplement to the general data protection regulation. If you are wondering why we need yet another new data protection rule from the EU because we had the general data protection regulation, that is true. The general data protection regulation will be enforced from May 2018, but it's a very general rule that is, for example, that applies to that gives us the rules for when we run a certain club, association, and store members' data on our computers. The e-privacy regulation is supposed to be a specific rule to supplement the general data protection regulation for the area of electronic communication, which I've just outlined. And that is being negotiated in Brussels, and the EU Commission this year put forth its draft, its suggestion. Now it's the turn of the EU Parliament and the EU Council, where the member states' governments are represented, to table their amendments. So now is a good time to take a closer look at the whole thing and what is in there. So just a brief precursor. Since 2002, there was an ePrivacy Directive. The EU always has two kinds of laws. One thing is the directive, which is the somewhat weaker form. It doesn't have direct force in member states. Member states have to transpose it into national law before it comes into force. And then on the other side, there's the regulation, which is the stronger instrument that the EU has, because that is directly applicable, becomes directly valid law in member states, without member states having to pass their own laws to make them effective. So since 2002, we've had the ePrivacy Directive, and that has the task, well, regulates what I've just talked about, to protect basic rights and basic freedoms, in particular respecting private lives, ensuring confidentiality of communication, and the protection of personal data in the area of electronic communication. And what I've just talked about sounds a bit funny if you think that it's supposed to be regulated since 2002, and it has to be said that there are some good guidelines in the old directive. It is more or less the progression of the postal and telecommunication secrecy. That's what it was historically. But concerning classic communication, what the telecom providers have about us, The ePrivacy Directive limits what can be done effectively, so spreading that kind of data through telecoms providers has had quite clear limits for a good while. But for the digital age, those rules, even if they have been worked on in 2002 and 2009, they have limited use. So this ketchup robot, for example, a nice idea, basically, but you can debate how effective it is. And this is due to the fact that the communication and media world has changed in the last years. Just consider two numbers, or four numbers rather. In 2012, we had more than 160 million SMS messages that were sent and only 20 million WhatsApp messages per day. In 2015, the whole thing has reversed. We have less than 40 million SMS messages per day, but more than 660 million WhatsApp messages. And these days is surely going to be even more. So where's the problem with the ePrivacy regulation? Sorry, the old directive. It doesn't apply to messengers, voice over IP and co., which are called over-the-top services. That's the technical term that is used in the EU for that. And that is due to the fact that the ePrivacy Directive was just a directive, and member states transposed it in very different ways. And, for example, it contains rules about dealing with cookies, tracking cookies, for example. But in Germany, they are interpreted quite differently from the way that France interprets it. In France, the cookie rules are enforced much stronger than in Germany. And it's also due to the fact that the rules were somewhat imprecise. There were backdoors. And also enforcing that law was kind of lacking. Different authorities were responsible for that. The network agencies, for example, in Germany, in some cases, and in other countries, the data protection commissioners. And these, until now, had little options of using sanctions. And good news there, the EU Commission really is tackling this. And in January, in their draft, there were some good points. These rules about confidentiality and data protection in electronic communication will now apply to over-the-top services as well. So that means, for one thing, messengers, internet telephony, of course, and SMS, classic communication, but also for direct messages in social networks or games or dating apps. So everywhere where there's electronic communication, and that applies to webmail as well. So the question whether Google really can scan their customers' emails and use the information for targeted advertising, that will be easier to decide in the future. A second positive aspect is that the EU Commission decided to take the path of regulating via regulation. So there is that is stronger, that's binding much more strongly, and oversight is unified and strengthened. So just like the General Data Protection Regulation from 2018 on, authorities will be able to have sanctions of 2 to 4% of annual turnover of a company, which of course means a lot. And then there is a fourth good aspect, because the EU Commission decided to retain a basic principle where it wasn't clear that they would do that, and that is that, in principle, surveillance is prohibited unless it is explicitly allowed, either through this regulation or through consent by the users. Because there was some kind of debate whether the model of the General Data Protection Regulation that was introduced there, whether that should be used and that is if companies have a certain legitimate interest in handling the data, and that can basically be anything, then a certain balance has to be struck between that legitimate interest and the interest of users not to be tracked. And that would mean that companies would have much more leeway in dealing with our data. So it's good that the EU Commission decided not to use that kind of rule from the General Data Protection Regulation and keep a principle, a prohibition of surveillance in principle. Okay, 10 points that, even though the EU Commission started out quite well, have to be improved in the ePrivacy regulation, and where there's a big chance that data protection can be furthered and tracking can be really limited.
What about consequently prohibiting tracking for sensible areas? Why don't you say in certain areas users shouldn't be allowed to allow companies to track their data? So, like, you all know how it is. You just click a button and then your data is being used. So why we don't identify areas where data is not allowed to be tracked? For example, underage people or health care data. Why don't we say that's like so critical that it should be absolutely forbidden to track that data? The second big point is about metadata. So data which is not the content of the message itself, but the data who is sending which message to whom. So in the background we see like communication tracked for a politician who got his data from his telecommunication provider, which makes it quite visible how the network of metadata can look and how that already allows a quite good picture about the data which is already given there.
So the idea is that processing data is allowed if the user concerned consents to it and if it's anonymized. So if someone wants to offer a service, say, about retailers, telling them which groups of people walk past their store in the morning, it would be possible to do that using communications metadata. Telecommunication providers know our age, they know our address, and they can track people through metadata, the mobile phone cell data, so they can track our movements. So these are data that is very interesting to retailers. And in future, this is supposed to be allowed if that purpose is also possible through anonymous data. It's not going to be allowed to consent to this. I'm not quite sure. So this is something that has to be improved, because we had the rules that providers, the data that providers can derive from our metadata automatically had to have an added value to the end user to be permissible. So that condition has now gone away, and the purposes for which data can be used, metadata can be used, do not really have to have an added value for the end user concerned whose data is being used. And in principle, through the depth of information that can be derived from metadata, it would be appropriate to say we no longer distinguish between metadata and content data. The analysis of content data is regulated in the ePrivacy regulation, because it says there that not just I as an individual have to consent, but all people that are taking part in that communication have to consent in evaluating such data. So if my metadata are being analyzed and an analysis is being made with whom I communicate, of course that yields the data about my communication partners as well. So other people's data are immediately involved. And a third demand about that would improve the protection of metadata would be an obligation to run assessments on the use of metadata, because these data have such an impact on the lives of the people concerned that the companies intending to analyze this data will have to run an assessment. That is a certain institutionalized process in which they have to consider the impact on the privacy of the people concerned. And if this then finds that sensitive areas are affected, then clearly it has to be said that the data commissioners have to be contacted. Okay, I realize my time's running out. I have to hurry up. Tracking. In the old directive, tracking, in principle, is to be prohibited but allowed with end users' consent in the new regulation. But here, the suggestion by the Commission is a certain overregulation of the old directive. It kind of gets rid of a certain overregulation in the old directive because even the cookies had to be displayed or consented to by users that are not really invasive to users' privacy but required for the page's functionality. And that is why on every page these days we have cookie banners. Even if it does not track us, we have to click to indicate our consent to the use of the cookies. Now, this is going to be abolished, but even with tracking, things can be improved. For example, tracking walls. You can see a cookie wall in the background there, are to be prohibited. You know that you have normally this take it or leave it principle. Either you consent to whatever we want to do with cookies on our site, or you cannot, or you can get more information and then leave our site, basically, if you don't want that. And that should be outlawed, clearly. That can't be a take it or leave it principle. No cookie or tracking walls. Surely that has to be outlawed. And then effective protection of particularly invasive tracking methods such as zombie cookies or reviving cookies should be outlawed in principle. And if people consent to tracking, this consent should be particularly informed. Now, I really have to speed up. Further, it's supposed to be still allowed that a certain audience measurement takes place. And in this, it should be made clear that, yes, you can analyze how many people visit my website and what they click on, but that cannot be a backdoor to set up profiling. And Wi-Fi and Bluetooth tracking, and this is a huge thing. This is supposed to be actually allowed as soon as the company is concerned, give a short notice about it happening. And surely there have to be clear limits for that. Only on the basis of an informed consent, this should be allowed. And wherever possible, data have to be anonymized. Now, two more important points. The others I'll have to skip. The EU Commission suggests that consent can also be given through settings in the browser or whatever device you use to access a site, which means that do not track that most companies simply ignore would then be enforced. And that would be, of course, a huge step forward if we can make one single setting in the browser that we don't want to be tracked, and companies have to abide by that. There again, the devil is in the detail. There are things to improve. Sorry, I have to skip that now. Then privacy settings. In an old draft of the regulation, it said that companies are obliged to browser makers, for example, that privacy settings have to be the default. Sadly, that has been taken out of the draft. It was in a leaked version that we had, but now the regulation says that at installation time, users should be asked which kind of settings they want. And of course, we want privacy by default. That would be a huge step forward. Direct marketing, I have to skip. Otherwise, people would just turn my microphone off. Read the texts on netzpolitik.org or other pages. The ePrivacy regulation has rules on direct marketing, So when can companies approach us directly, under which conditions? There are things to improve there. Then the ePrivacy regulation has exceptions for state access. Data retention remains possible. This would have been a huge chance to say that data retention is simply not allowed. I'll have to skip security issues, so just briefly at the end, the option exists to stop data slings. Better tracking, better protections are possible. Protecting our lives from permanent collection recording is possible. Depends on the right decisions being made in Brussels. Now, various companies have all been lobbying in Brussels to completely take out the ePrivacy regulation. The pressures are high. So therefore, even if this was somewhat brief, I can only recommend, by pleading to you, fight for your digital rights. This is what's going to happen, and this is where finally you can have clear limits for tracking. But what it needs for that is public attention. It needs people that engage and that strengthen the organizations that work for interests of users and data protection here and in Brussels. So that is my plea to you. I hope that this gave you a brief insight into the topic, and I would be glad if you can, if our fight within the ePrivacy regulation will get your support. Thank you. Thank you. Ingo Dachwitz, he did say at first that he has timing problems often, so we have a certain delay of a few minutes because we'll continue. But you can stay seated because we'll continue immediately